Hello and welcome to our special coverage on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. 1 month after Russian President Vladimir Putin asserted that Ukraine should be liberated from the historical mistake of its independence, the Russian Defense Ministry has announced that Russia's war aims with a limited, or let's say, the aims were limited to the Donbas region and were nearing completion. This climb down is undoubtedly laying the groundwork for selling the operation as a success to the Russian public, despite an awful military combat performance. But that does not mean a rapid end to the war, despite the diplomatic talks. The stalled operation raised many questions, few of which we will be discussing with our panel of guests. We have via Skype Dr. Claudio Solani, editor of Strategic Alert Service in Germany, and also Valentin Yakovic, a professor of political science from Kiev. And via phone, we have Dr. Mahfoud Ali Zoui, author and academic lecturer from Algeria. Thank you for all guests for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into any discussion, let's start with the latest updates on Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry said it will drastically reduce military activity on Kiev and Chernihiv following talks in Istanbul. Ukraine accuses Russia of intensifying attacks on Chernihiv despite a Russian promise to scale back, according to the northern region's governor. Ukraine's military states that Russia's move is intended to mislead its forces. Meanwhile, Ukrainian president says Kiev will not reduce its defensive efforts. UK military intelligence says Russia is still a significant threat to Kiev. Let me start with you, Dr. Claudio Solani. How do you read the latest developments? Are we going to see a resolution to this conflict anytime soon?
Well, as I often insisted, I think we will see a resolution of this conflict only when a general negotiation between the United States, NATO on one side, and Russia on the other side will take place on the demands laid out by Russia before the war, which concern the build-up of a security architecture in Europe, which takes account of the security interests of all participants. The Ukraine war has never been, in my view, a Ukrainian thing. This is a stage where the confrontation between NATO and Russia is taking place. And as the Russians demanded before the war, I think this resolution to the Ukrainian conflict will be achieved, will come out only when there is a change in the relationship between Washington and Moscow.
Very nice indeed. Professor Valentin Yakovic, do you agree with our distinguished guest, Dr. Claudio Solani? Ukraine's military states that Russian move is intended to only mislead its forces, and Ukrainian president says Kiev will not reduce its defensive efforts. Do you think that is war going to linger on? Are we going to see a continuation of the... Yes, go ahead, please.
In my view, unfortunately, we are doomed to a relatively long-term war. Now we had very positive results for the citizens of Ukraine of the talks in Istanbul. They are good as a theory. In practice, it's unlikely that this would be a compromise between Ukraine and Russia. No part is ready to accept compromise. Each party wants to win the war. Russians, when they said that they did proposed two concessions, no, these are not concessions. meeting between the presidents in Istanbul, which is proposed by the Russian delegation. Well, it doesn't mean anything if we do not have the contents for the discussions. And Russian troops' partial withdrawal from its positions near Kiev and Chernihiv, they mean nothing, just reshaping of Russian front line and taking the troops from Kiev, where they cannot advance, to the east, where they will continue advance near Mariupol and in Donbass. So nothing has changed, and it seems that we are doomed for a long-term war. It may be finished with two possible scenarios or solutions. First, the defeat of the invaders, and then there will be peace truce on the conditions of Europe and Ukraine. The second, serious defeat of Ukrainians. Then there will be some chance for Russia to impose its terms of peace agreement on Ukraine, but it's unlikely to happen. Even if there is defeat of the military forces of Ukraine, there will be guerrilla warfare. And American presidents and American officials were planning this, explaining that they are ready to support Ukrainian guerrillas. It was said more than months ago. The third possible scenario is a stalemate, like it was during the First World War in the Western Front for Germany and in the German front for France and Britain. And the fourth, it's a miracle when a Messiah comes here and there is something with the God's will, or when there are revolutions. Well, the First World War led to revolutions in a number of countries. So hopefully, if the first two positive for Ukraine scenarios, when Ukraine defeats the invaders or when there is a stalemate, then if it doesn't happen, then we will have to think about the God's will to bring us a miracle. Sometimes it happens, but I'm very pessimistic now, and Ukrainians are suffering a lot. Ukrainian infrastructures are destroyed. 4 million people fled abroad. We are facing the lack of food very soon because the spring agricultural works usually do not start now in central and eastern Ukraine. What can we produce? Ukraine has been exporter of agricultural goods, and now we need support from outside. And there is also a big problem for Ukraine. This is looting of ordinary people's things which are left in their homes, which they left. Today I received a call from one Ukrainian who is in touch with those who see what is happening on the territories near Kiev, which are occupied by Russian troops. Soldiers, they are looting everything from the houses, which were left also by neighbors. So I think Algerians who have good relations with Russians, they should mention to their embassy and then to the leadership, behave yourselves, Russian soldiers. In former times in the Soviet Union, during the Second World War, Stalin and his military, they were shooting such Soviet soldiers who were looting the population to which they come. Just think how these people of Ukraine would be thinking of you, of future generations of Russians, if first they destroy the infrastructures, they kick away people. Thousands of people are dead, ordinary people, ordinary Ukrainian citizens, and when their houses are looted by those who come. And also, they do not control what are wild locals who live there, what they do also with these properties of Ukrainians. According to the rules of war, the property and the life have to be protected. Lives of Ukrainians are not protected. Their properties are not protected. The world community, please pay attention to this. Help
Point clear.
Ukrainians to survive.
Very nice. Dr. Mahfoud Ali is joining us. Mahfoud Ali Zoui via phone. As you've been listening to Professor Yukoshik, forgot the name, sorry, Professor. As our distinguished guest was saying, Ukraine is suffering, and meanwhile Russia is always considered a threat to Western nations, and Russia is aware of NATO's expansion's plans to corner it, with Ukraine accepting neutrality. Is this going to give Russia a veto power as to decide who can and who can't join NATO?
Okay, first of all, let's not underestimate the outcomes of yesterday's Istanbul talks. I have been listening to declarations from high-ranking officials from both sides. We cannot describe the outcomes as a breakthrough that's real, but at the end there is a consensus that the talks constitute the most significant development since the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, this crisis. So,
Mahfoud Ali Zoui, I don't know whether you have been listening to Professor Yukoshik Valentin. He was saying that it's just ink on paper. It's not something really just theoretical. And on the ground, Ukrainians are still suffering, and their property is being looted, and they are facing significant challenges in their own country, and they are fleeing to bordering.
I'm coming to this.
Yes.
I'm coming to it. Let's establish something before coming to this. At the end, the war will end through diplomatic means, and a long-term conflict will be destructive not only to the belligerents but to the whole world. Maybe we nowadays there are some shortages, food shortages in the global south, in African countries, in the Middle East, and many countries in the world. There are prospects of some economic crisis and different types of crisis. Let's focus on the winds of hope and optimism that have been sent by yesterday's talks. I'm not talking from the top of my mind. I mean, this is according to the declarations by high-ranking politicians from Ukraine and from Russia, that as described by Russian officials, the negotiations are constructive, and they can pave the way for further, more fruitful negotiations in the future. What happened yesterday is that the Ukraine gave a proposition, a detailed proposal for a peaceful settlement of the conflict, which is based on a pledge to give up its peace to join NATO or any military alliance, but at the same time retaining its right to join the European Union in exchange for, let's say, a security plan, a security system for Ukraine that will be guaranteed by some international powers. They are talking about a possible role of Turkey, Poland, the United States, France, Canada, and maybe Israel. And Moscow also, in its turn, promised to scale back its military activity around the cities of Kiev and Chernihiv to increase mutual trust. But we know for certain that mutual distrust and skepticism from the West is still there. We have reports this morning that, as a matter of fact, shelling and bombardment did not stop, but in some regions it even increased and intensified, which increases the distrust and skepticism within some Western capitals. But yet, let's confirm the fact that there is no other way except for sitting to the table of negotiations. And
speaking of negotiations, Mahfoud Ali Zoui, I suppose that I would invite my distinguished guests and their viewers to follow these reports about the talks between Russian and Ukrainian delegations, which were hosted in the Turkish city of Istanbul. Moscow said it would drastically reduce military activity near the Ukrainian cities of Kiev and Chernihiv. But the US and other Western leaders were skeptical, saying they would judge Russia by its actions and not its words.
A glimmer of hope for a possible truce in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, after talks hosted in a Turkish palace in Istanbul, which are seen by Ankara's foreign minister as the most significant since the beginning of the crisis.
The most significant progress since the start of the talks was made today.
The first signs of progress towards negotiating peace started after Russia has promised to scale down its military operations near the Ukrainian capital, Kiev.
After today's substantial conversation, we agreed and suggest solution according to which the meeting of the heads of the state is possible. It is possible to discuss various political nuances and details. Thus, in case of quick work on the agreement, the opportunity to conclude peace will become much closer.
While Ukraine proposed adopting neutral status, something Russia has constantly asked for, and Kiev wants exchanging military neutrality for security guarantees.
Of course, the agreement on security guarantees can only be signed after the ceasefire and the withdrawal of all Russian troops to the positions compromised upon, those as of 23rd February 2022.
But early today, the governor of Chernihiv, some 145 kilometers from Kiev, posted an online video saying Russia has shelled the city last night, while in Kiev, a fire broke out after a strike in a warehouse in the Brovary district.
I get back to you, Dr. Claudio Solani. We see that there is no trust from Western nations towards Russia's statements and that they would believe in action and not words, seeing the fact that Russia said it wasn't planning to make any incursion in Ukraine. But days later, they conducted what it called a special military operation, according to what could Russia be hiding to Western nations. What is your take on this, and why is Russia's military performing so poorly?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that we should believe Western propaganda on how Russia is performing on the ground. I mean, we are in a war, and in a war, both sides are counting on massive propaganda. We call it the fog of war. So I wouldn't trust really much things coming from either side. Of course, we have cut all most channels to Moscow's, Russia's information channels, so we have basically de facto only one side. But I would pick up from what our two guests have said. First of all, I believe in miracles. They are difficult. They don't occur every day, but they do occur. For example, one miracle has occurred yesterday in Yemen, where there was a ceasefire agreed between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi forces. And now they are not shooting anymore there. We don't know how long this is going to last, because the reasons, the motivation for the decisions are not announced officially. But as usual, I will put this in context with the larger picture. I mean, we should understand that everybody has made mistakes on the Ukraine case. Russia has moved militarily, and everybody is condemning a military action because a war means destruction, and we have heard what the horrible situation is in Ukraine from our friend in Ukraine. But the West has made many mistakes, and the Ukrainian government also has made terrible mistakes. I mean, let me just point to one of them. When the German Chancellor Scholz went to Kiev, and from Kiev then went to Moscow, assuring Putin that Zelensky had promised him that he would draft a law now, a legislation to recognize, to implement the Minsk agreements. The moment Scholz was telling this Putin, the Ukrainian army was shooting in the Donbass, intensifying the attack on the Donbass. And the Ukrainian government had 8 years' time to implement the Minsk agreements, which they themselves had signed. Now, the West, and by this I mean NATO, have made terrible mistakes, and they are, in my view, the main responsibles of this situation, because they have lured Ukraine into a trap. They've promised them that they would take Ukraine into NATO. And then at the eve of the Russian attack, they literally flew away from Ukraine. And they say, okay, you fight the war, we don't fight the war, you will die in this war, which we have created the condition for. I mentioned the other day that there was a special team set up in the Biden administration in order to create and facilitate these conditions. But so, since we all have made these mistakes, let's look at the perspective of how we get this miracle done. And there is no other way to get the miracles done that the West recognizes Russia's security reasons and starts a discussion on this. This has to take place in Washington in the first place, and they have to abandon the intentions which they have expressed. On the 25th of January, the White House informed journalists that the aim of February, that their aim was to destroy Russia economy, that they would make it impossible for Russia to become a developed industrial nation. They would destroy its industry, and that's what they are doing now with the sanctions. So this has to be changed.
Mm-hmm. Professor Valentin Yakushik, whose war is this, and who's winning it? I mean, definitely not the Ukrainian people who are suffering the consequences. I mean, all the suffering that has been inflicted on them due to the current circumstances, as you mentioned earlier, fleeing their country to neighboring countries, looking for a shelter, for food, for a shelter and safety haven for their children and the future of their children. The same thing perhaps goes for Russian nationals who are suffering the economic sanctions as well, and who are witnessing their lives changing. Whose war is this, Professor?
Who are suffering most? Ordinary people in Ukraine and in Russia. Now there is dehumanization of politics in both countries, in Russia and in suffering Ukraine. Now, most of Ukrainians are hating not only Russian leadership, but start hating all Russians. Mm-hmm. In Russia, they create a wrong image of Ukrainians. So it would be as if Algerians will hate all Moroccans and Moroccans will hate all Algerians. What's that? It's a fratricidal war, what is underway. Russian leadership has committed not only a criminal act by attacking Ukraine, but it went and drew Russia into a trap, after which Russian people will be suffering during long time. More than that, if I come to a not maybe appropriate, but okay, I use it comparison. If there is a conflict between Algeria and Morocco, between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, who suffers? Suffer ordinary Muslims, ordinary Arabs, and it should be avoided. This is a blow for the civilization of East Slavic people. We will be experiencing its negative results for many, many years. The same as wars between Arab countries. It influences the whole state of Arab world, the whole state of Muslim world. So, as we started talking about the miracle, as during the First World War, those who started it, they could never have expected that the monarchies in Germany, in Austria-Hungarian Empire, in Russia, will cease to exist. The same corrupt regimes will cease to exist in a number of countries after the consequences of this war. Russian oligarchic regime already started its transformation. All internal circle of President Putin has suffered from the sanctions, from severe measures. They are not happy with what is happening. Now only the leader remains who is ruling. Russia will need new regime. It will have a regime change, after which there will be corrections in its internal and external policies.
And after
Ukraine
the statements
is
of
ready
Joe
to
Biden,
fight.
U.S. President Joe Biden, he said that he was not seeking a regime change in Russia. What's your take on this, Professor Yokoshik?
It's not up to President Biden to decide. If there is God there, and if there are rules, if there are norms of development of the history, it's not upon him. President Biden has a lot of drawbacks, after which he will also be taken to responsibility, and not only by the supporters of Mr. Trump. There will be more justice in this world after we analyze and decide who is responsible for Ukrainian tragedy. And it's not only Ukrainian tragedy, it's Russia's nation tragedy. It's European tragedy, because Europe will suffer a lot. And if Americans now are coming to Algeria with, I suppose, the request to stop conflict with Morocco and start exporting more through the pipeline of gas, through those pipelines which go through Morocco, it means that some alternative ways are looked for making European market suffer less. But I do not know how it will happen if Russia stops exports of its gas to Europe. It's increasing economic results of the conflict. Many European nations will come out of this conflict between the West and Russia also with serious changes. So we are facing some changes in the world politics, after which we will have to be more democratic and more allied with the higher forces. God wants us to be more human. There is so much inhumanity in our life. We have to be just and find a solution for Ukrainian crisis, and then for all other aspects which led to this conflict, to this war, rearranging relations between the West and the East, and relations between different world regions. Now we are coming to the world, which will not be a global world. It will be a world of different civilizations and alliances of civilizations realigned into regions of the world. We have to start thinking about the next steps. All old elites, they will have to retreat, and a lot of them will be overthrown, like those in Russia. They will not be able to exploit Russia after 30 years of their experiment, these oligarchic forces. Definitely in Ukraine will be changes. Old elites and the present unprepared young people who were ruling during the last 3 years, they will be changed by people who show themselves in this war as real patriots and as professionals.
Very nice. Thank you, Valentin Yokoshik, for these explanations. Now, let me get back to you, Dr. Mahfoud Ali Zoui. As you have been following, Dr. Valentin, or Professor Valentin, was talking about what the war means for ordinary Ukrainians and ordinary people around the globe. And he was talking about the repercussions, the possible repercussions, the shift of power, the new world order. What is your take in this, Doctor?
I do really agree with the previous speaker on the far-reaching implications of the war. Let's say if the war ends helpfully in the foreseeable future, there will be some lasting impacts on the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians, not only on the level of the state, but also on the level of the people. And this is very serious because we should not forget about the historical ties and relationships between the two people. That's why the sooner the war ends, the better, and the less.
And if you have been following Mahfoud Ali Zoui, Dr. Valentin also mentioned the fact that the Arab nations are being pressed, so let's say pressured by the US, so as perhaps to increase their energy or the production of their energy products. And we are witnessing, as you know, Antony Blinken's visit here to Algeria, and Valentin was analyzing that perhaps it's related to the fact that they should resolve the conflict with Morocco Morocco and start pumping gas through the gas pipeline crossing the the Mediterranean, going through, let's say, Morocco. What's your take on this?
This is part of the conflict. The conflict does not concern the belligerents only. I mean, Russia and Ukraine. The Western allies of Ukraine are, of course, really pressing many countries to boost the production of gas in order to increase the influence of. To decrease the dependence on the Russian gas and to decrease the influence of possible cut of gas supplies from Russia to Western European countries. And, for example, the stance of Algeria and the Algerian diplomacy, which is based on rationality and deeply rooted principles, is trying to keep a balance between the two parties. They say that Algeria supports negotiations and a prompt, peaceful settlement of the conflict because a long-term conflict will influence also the Algerian economy in a way or another. So let's get, if you allow me to get back to the origin of the problem. I think now that we should look forward for negotiations, further negotiations, and the Istanbul talks, I believe, are paving the way.
So, Mahfoud Ali, you are optimistic about the negotiations and the diplomatic talks, despite the fact that we noticed, or as Professor Valentin said, there is just ink on paper, and perhaps the Russian troops are just redeploying themselves, and they are not really retrieving. And if we bring about the point of energy, I get back to the point of energy, which I find pretty important since Valentin brought it up. We noticed that the Houthi rebels targeted energy plants in Saudi Arabia, and which slowed the production and creating a further complication. So we see these Arab countries perhaps are being dragged into this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And as you know, Arab countries are not really able to defend themselves, and they might actually cede to certain pressures. What's your take on this?
Battles are, battles are still taking place. Shelling is going on. Why? Simply because both belligerents know that at the end, it is the situation on the battleground that will ultimately influence the trajectory of negotiations. And this is very expected. But, let's keep optimistic. Once again, I confirm that the only way out of this conflict is through negotiations. The main point of this agreement, I believe, is in the third condition set by the Russians to end the war. If we remember, from the very beginning, Russia set three main conditions, or three main aims of the military operation, and three main conditions at the same time to end the war. The first one is related to demilitarization of Ukraine. The second has to do with pushing Ukraine to give up its ambition to join NATO or any military alliance. These two are workable. I think that already there have been some good progress in negotiations about these 2 points. Okay. But the third point is the most complicated point. The third point relates to Russia's demand that Ukraine should recognize Crimea as a Russian territory, and they recognize also that the Donetsk and Lugansk as independent state, which obviously Ukraine is not ready to recognize.
Yes, Mahfoud Ali Zoui, and in the same line of your thoughts, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that he sees positive signs in Istanbul peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. However, he promises that Kiev will not reduce its defense efforts. Let's take a listen.
We can say that the signs we are hearing from negotiations are positive, but these signs do not cover Russian shell explosions. That is why we are not going to calm down. We are not going to decrease our defense efforts, both in the north of our state and in all regions of Ukraine where Russian troops have temporarily entered. We must not lose our vigilance. The situation has not become easier. The scale of the challenges has not diminished. The Russian military still has significant potential to continue attacks against our state.
I get back to you, Dr. Claudio Celani. What is the U.S. role in this conflict? Some analysts are saying that perhaps USA is making things worse. What's your take on this?
Well, the current administration, or let's say the faction that dictates policy in the current U.S. administration, is the one that wants a long devastating war. They are out of it, and the reason why they want this war is because they have created a situation in which some financial values go up. It's as simple as that. I mean, the dynamic of confrontation between the United States and the Western system, NATO, etc., with Russia is dictated at this point by a collapsing financial system, which has been in coma at least from September 12, 2019. You have to look at the dynamic that comes out of this situation, and if you see the coincidence of NATO and US and British policy towards Russia, with the interests that are connected to the military-industrial complex, which are financial interests and Wall Street, etc., then you understand what the problem is. So I think, since I believe in miracles, I think the moment in which we understand in the West that this situation is making things worse, not only for Ukraine, not only for Russia, but also for us, because with the sanctions, we are going into exactly that self-inflicted crisis which our friend from Ukraine was describing. Today, the German government has started the first step towards energy emergency. This means that at the third step, they will start cutting energy to corporations, to industrial complexes. And that's because they are afraid that now comes April the 1st, they won't be able to solve a problem that the Russians want the gas be paid in rubles. And since the EU energy minister said, no, we don't want to pay it in rubles, the spokesman of the Kremlin, Mr. Peskov, said, okay, we won't give you gas. And I read in Reuters this morning that yesterday one of the gas pipelines, the Yamal pipeline, is not carrying gas since yesterday.
So this is one example of how the rest of the world is responding to Russia's actions. And perhaps here I ask Professor Valentin Yokoshik how he sees the rest of the world responding to Russia's actions. How do you see the reactions? Are they enough? Can the world do more?
The world is reacting on the activities state-to-state relations and is using what is possible with these sanctions against Russia as a country. But the world is not acting on the spiritual level and the conceptual level of relations between civilizations. Now it's time to propose something more than just state-to-state relations. To think about the future world order, which will not be the order of one hegemon. It would be a regionalized world, and we should start discussing them and moving towards them. If we start talking about miracles, they are prepared. When we analyze today's Saudi-Yemeni situation, first of all, it's a stalemate after many years of war. I wouldn't like to have this stalemate after many years of war between Ukraine and Russia. And the second is, I suppose, a friendly advice of the United States to guarantee that Saudi export capacities should not be undermined by any external attacks. The same kind of approach, preparing a miracle, should be used towards
Very nice.
Ukraine.
Thank you so
But
much,
where are
Valentin
these
Yakushik. We ran out of time. I would have loved to give Dr. Mahfoud Ali a final word, but we're running out of time. Thank you, dear distinguished guests, for being with us. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Our special coverages continue day by day. Bye for now.